Welcome to In Our Powers, self-defense for those afraid to get physical. I'm Carolyn, a trauma-informed feminist self-defense coach. If you are tired of feeling unsafe but afraid of physical confrontation, you're in the right place. Here, we use a more expansive definition of self-defense to include anything we do to protect and honor ourselves. Here, we practice stepping into our powers, standing in our powers together to be able to find true safety within. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to this show and also subscribing to my Substack newsletter, Powers. Let's begin. Today, I want to talk about how and why I started self-defense. And I want to start by acknowledging that it's been a really long journey to get here. I remember the very first time I even heard about the concept of self-defense. I was probably 12 or 13 years old. I was watching a movie with my dad, who trained as a wrestler in high school. And there was a scene in the movie where a man was encroaching on a woman, really with the intent to do her harm. And my dad turned to me and said, if anyone tries to touch you in a way that makes you uncomfortable, you have permission to do whatever you need to do to get him to stop and get off of you. And at the time, I was so confused by that advice. I knew what sex was, but the concept of sexual assault or rape, even sexual harassment, was something that I was not familiar with at all at 12 or 13 years old. And so, I saved that away in my mind, kind of went on with life. And then in high school, started to experience a lot more sexual harassment, unwanted touching, in intimate relationships, some pressure to do things that I didn't really want to do. And then at around age 16, 17 in high school, I had my first experience with sexual assault. I was a math SAT tutor who was in his 70s, violated my physical boundaries in a way that was so confusing to me. And the best way that I knew how to protect myself at the time was to freeze and to do my best to please him. And through this show, we'll talk about how actually freezing is an option for self-defense. And the way that adults responded to that situation was, to acknowledge what happened and then say, you'll just never have to see that man again. And we kind of moved on from there. And then continuing into, graduating from high school, going into college, even my early professional career, continue to experience sexual harassment, unwanted touching, in a lot of different capacities, both in social settings and then even in professional settings at work as well. But the whole concept of a self-defense course or taking self-defense felt so abstract and kind of out of reach. At the time, especially in high school and college, my best understanding of self-defense was actually watching Sandra Bullock in Miss Congeniality. She has the acronym SING. I think it's sinus, instep, nose, and groin, was my best kind of mental map for self-defense. I remember in college, someone told me that the best way to defend myself at night was to put my key in between my fingers. And if someone came up to me, to use that key between my fingers to throw a punch. That always confused me because I thought about the key, how would I get the key in between my fingers and wouldn't it hurt my palm? From there, I remember in college participating in, I think it was an hour-long self-defense workshop as a part of my sorority. And during that workshop, they were throwing out all of these physical techniques, things that we should be thinking about. And I walked away from it. The only thing I remembered was that my elbows were sharp. And so, moving through college and in my early professional career, my best strategy was to, use my key between my fingers and then maybe try to claw at someone with my elbow. Not very effective, not very well informed. But yeah, it was like the best tools that I had been handed at the time. And it's interesting reflecting back on it now, why it took me so much time to really get curious about self-defense or start self-defense. I think there's a couple of different dimensions to it. The first is that I think I had this belief that even though I had been sexually assaulted once already, and I knew a lot of people in my life who had experienced either sexual assault or rape, I really wanted to hold on to this belief that it wasn't going to happen to me again, or that it wouldn't happen to me. And so I think that's something that I kind of like reassured myself, like, oh, I'm in safe context. That's not going to happen to me. I think another dimension of it was just being really busy. Between college, I worked a really intense career early in my professional life. The thought of signing up for a regular self-defense class or even finding time for a workshop felt completely out of reach and like the lowest priority thing relative to everything else. And then I think one of the biggest things that prevented me from even getting curious about a class or exploring a class was that I was terrified. I was really afraid to go take a workshop or sign up for a class. I was afraid to be in a situation where I might have to hit someone, let alone be hit myself. I was afraid of, being in physical confrontation with someone I might not know very well. I was also afraid of the kind of emotional and psychological dimensions of attending a self-defense class. Walking into a self-defense class, there was part of me that knew I was going to have to confront the experience that I had in high school. And not just the experience I had in high school, but, every other moment when someone had sexually harassed me or had touched me in unwanted ways, had violated my body's boundaries. Signing up for that self-defense class was going to be the moment when I really needed or was going to be asked to confront all of that, which is terrifying. And so that's probably why, I experienced sexual assault when I was 16, 17, which realistically, it's actually sexual exploitation at that point. But it was more than 15 years later before I actually found the courage to actually go take a self-defense class. And it's interesting, I think part of why I finally found the courage to do it is I started seeing a therapist, as I think many people did during COVID. And this therapist helped me actually confront what happened in high school. And then she was also helping me work through really persistent feelings of anxiety and fear in life more broadly. She helped me understand that I was experiencing an anxiety disorder. But that kind of fear, anxiety persisted everything I was experiencing in life. And, around the same time, actually, before I go into that next part, one thing that my therapist told me at the time that I found really helpful and powerful is she suggested when I was in that place of anxiety or fear to move through it and reconnect with my power. And that could be physical power. It could be really any dimension of power. It could be the power in my voice. It could be the power in my creativity. It could be my power in community, in the relationships that I have. And so she was coaching me really anytime I was in that place of anxiety or fear to move through it into a place where I was reconnecting with my power. And so it's interesting. Around the same time, I happened to rewatch one of my favorite movies from childhood. The movie is Ever After with Drew Barrymore. It's kind of a more modern progressive telling of Cinderella. And Drew Barrymore plays this character, Daniel de Barbarac, who is a total like badass Cinderella character. She disguises as a courtier to free a slave. She speaks truth to the prince, criticizes his leadership to his face. She actually defends the prince against bandits in the woods. And there's a scene in the movie when an older man, probably similar to the age of my math SAT tutor, sexually assaults her, violates her physical boundaries. And she responds with such incredible fierceness. She uses her voice first to set a really clear boundary around her body. And then when it's not respected and violated, she pulls out a sword and slashes the man across his face. And I, remember sitting there, as I'm processing this sexual assault experience from high school, trying to move through all this fear and anxiety, seeing this character who I had loved and admired when I was a kid, and just being in awe of her power and badassery, really, in a lot of ways. And I remember watching the credits roll on that movie and deciding that it was time. I was ready. I wanted to be able to use my voice to set boundaries like that. I wanted to be able to metaphorically wield that sword and be able to fight back if and when I needed to, instead of slipping into a place of freezing and pleasing in the way I had in that initial experience with sexual assault, but then in so many other dimensions of my life as well. And so that was really the start of me pursuing self-defense in a more intentional way. And it's interesting. I'll talk a little bit about how I got started. From that moment of realizing I was really motivated to take a class, I got in touch with a friend who had been training in self-defense for over 16 years. And this friend is very different from me. I'm 5'3". He's over 6 foot tall. He had been training in self-defense, for over 16 years. Even bragged about, melon-sized bruises and moments when he had gotten concussions, that sort of thing. But he was my best resource to go to know, where do I even start when it comes to this self-defense stuff? Where do I find a class? Because there's so many different resources and options out there. Where do you even begin? And so he recommended a fighter's gym based locally here in Pittsburgh. It's Wright's Gym, founded by a former law enforcement officer, Dave Wright. And it teaches all sorts of different martial arts classes and self-defense tools. The different classes that they offer are Krav Maga, Muay Thai, Jiu-Jitsu, boxing. There's a whole kind of breadth of resources there. And my friend recommended that I start with Krav Maga because it was designed specifically for real-world context. Krav Maga kind of takes tools from all sorts of different martial arts forms, focuses on the ones that are most practical and intuitive when you're in a real life-threatening situation to respond. Just looking at the website, I was freaking out a little bit. And I remember I was texting back and forth with this friend, and he was like, yeah, it would probably be good to buy a pair of hand wraps. And there are hand wraps that come with gel in them, so they're really easy to put on and use. And I looked at his text message, and I was like, oh my goodness, hand wraps. I don't know what I've gotten myself into. I think maybe in my mind, I thought I could take a self-defense class and it wasn't going to involve punching anything. I think that's probably what I hoped. But I, again, being in this place of fear and anxiety and wanting to step into my power, I ordered the hand wraps. I signed up for a class. I was so nervous the days leading up to it, even the drive from my house to the gym. I entered this fighter's gym and felt so out of place. Again, I'm 5'3". I was wearing my, little like turquoise yoga pants, and I had a pink pedicure. And most of the people in the gym are the type of person that's like pounding protein, pumping iron, big dudes, a lot of current and former law enforcement officers. And yeah, it was really intimidating. And, not every self-defense class or self-defense workshop is hosted in the same context. This was just my personal experience that I'm sharing with you. So I don't want to scare you off from trying a class. But so it was so interesting taking that first class, stepping onto the mat with the instructors. Again, it was asking me to repeatedly step from this place of fear and anxiety into my power. In that class, I hit something for the very first time. I don't remember ever hitting something before that. Not only did I hit a pad, I was asked to hold a pad for someone else to hit. I learned how to kick effectively if I were ever to need to kick someone in the groin. It kind of just felt like diving right into the deep end in terms of like, okay, here we go. This is what different strikes look like. This is how you use your arms and your legs to fight back in a real physical sense. And it was amazing. I think my body was probably in a state of fight or flight mode for most of that first class. And it wasn't until I stepped outside of the gym, and it had gotten dark at that point. I stepped into the dark parking lot, and I realized I was experiencing a level of peace that I hadn't experienced in a really long time. And I think part of why that is that there is a huge emotional release when we step into our physical power. Even just the bilateral movement of throwing punches can be an emotional release of fear, anxiety, anger in our body in a really powerful way. And so I think that was really at play. Stepping out of that gym, I knew I had a lot to learn. I knew it was just the first step on a long journey. But I also knew, having seen other people in the class, and there were a couple of other women in the class too, seeing their power, their ability to step into their body's power, I think I realized that I had it in me to do the same. And then, walking through that dark parking lot to get to my car, I think there was also this like psychological shift that happened. For the first time, I realized that I had the capacity to shift out of a place of freezing and pleasing into a place of fighting back if I needed to. It was like I was like adding another tool to my toolbox to be able to respond to situations. And a new tool that I didn't quite know how to use in a sophisticated way yet. But knowing that tool was even an option and like psychologically shifting to know that it was an option felt really powerful. And so from that first class, I really felt hooked. I was hooked to that feeling of being in a powerful place in my body again and kind of expanding my toolkit. And even just feeling more confident and more powerful moving through the world. And so from that point of starting self-defense, I've been on a long journey since then. That was back in 2022 when I started practicing physical self-defense in a more intentional way. And so now it's been 3.5, almost 4 years. I've studied Krav Maga quite in depth. I have a yellow belt and probably have capacities beyond a yellow belt, but haven't tested additional levels. I've taken boxing classes. I've taken jujitsu classes. And then I've also participated in different self-defense workshops specifically. There's a fantastic organization based here in Pittsburgh. It's Set Point Empowerment Self-Defense, if I'm remembering that correctly. And they do a fantastic job of coaching people on really concrete, trauma-informed tools and give people a space to practice. And then most recently, I completed a basic physical defense instructor certification with Rape Aggression Defense, which is an organization that offers self-defense coaching for women across the US. I don't know if they're international. But yeah, so it's been a long journey since that start. And it's so interesting because when I was completing this instructor certification recently, on the very first day of the training, they were talking about how, self-defense only, I think they say 10% of it is physical. The other 90% is about how we manage risk. I'll double check my notes here. So according to Rape Aggression Defense, they say that 90% of self-defense is risk awareness, risk reduction, risk recognition, and risk avoidance. And I remember sitting in this instructor training and just being floored by that fact that 90% of self-defense actually has nothing to do with the physical. It's like everything that we do on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment basis before we experience a physical confrontation. And I remember sitting in that training and realizing that there was a huge opportunity for my 16, 17-year-old self, probably even younger, maybe that, 12, 13-year-old version of myself that had that first conversation with my dad, to realize that actually practicing self-defense starts way before you ever find the courage or the desire to step into a fighter's gym or a workshop. It's about how we stand in our power, what our relationship with risk is, how we move through the world on a day-to-day basis. And it makes me even think about that character in Ever After that Drew Barrymore played, Danielle de Barbarac, where she fully embodied this kind of power in the way she engaged in relationships, in the way that she protected time and space for herself, the way she not only protected herself, but also advocated for other people. And that self-defense can be much more expansive than thinking about punches and kicks. And so that's part of the inspiration for this podcast, how I've arrived here in this moment, particularly using this more expansive definition of self-defense to include everything that we do, anything that we do to honor and protect ourselves. And that can be as individuals, it also can be as a collective or as a community. Yeah. So I want to say thank you so much for listening today. Thank you for listening to this journey. I'm thrilled to be on this podcast journey with you and to continue to share my practices, my self-defense coaching with you. I'll end by saying thanks to listening to In Our Powers. self-defense for those afraid to get physical. You can find resources and links from this episode in the show notes, wherever you are listening. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the show and to my Substack newsletter, Powers, for more practices. Let's move through fear and stand in our powers together.